All right, well, good morning again. We are in our second class on Exodus. Jordan mentioned we'll be flying through the book in 13 lessons. So, if you hear us say what the chapters are for the upcoming week, make sure you do some reading ahead of time, because there's no way for us to cover every verse and everything that is here to get out of it in a survey like this. But I'm excited about the course. I'm excited about the overall study of the Torah, the Pentateuch, as we go through the Sunday morning auditorium class this year, and just getting a great overview of that. We are going to be digging into Exodus 3 here. I guess by way of review, what ways have we seen so far that Christ and Moses were a type and an anti-type? Or what allegories are there between Christ and Moses, particularly through their birth story? I had three in mind. I'm sure there's more. Traveled to Egypt, okay? They both had a childhood in Egypt of some regard. I'm sorry? Delivered their people. That definitely will happen.
When they were babies, the leaders in their respective regions were trying to kill many of the babies that were born.
Many of the boys. There was a threat to them in their early years and at birth between Herod and Pharaoh.
Redeemer to save their people.
Yeah, well, my question's about birth, but they definitely were being called to come and save, call in and be deliverers. I think also, there was a divine protection for both of them. Jesus' father had a dream. Moses' mother put him in this basket, and Pharaoh's daughter found him and cared for him. Like, those aren't just things that casually happen. There was some divine intervention there. And then I was thinking about how they both chose humility. So as we wrapped up chapter 2, Moses is fleeing Egypt. He's leaving his throne, if you will. And we see Christ doing that very similar in an analogous way from leaving heaven. And we're going to come back to these allegories throughout the course of this class. Just because there's so much of it throughout the book that really focuses on how Moses and Christ were similar. And you'll remember from our recent study in Hebrews that Christ was a better version of Moses. But certainly that's not a discredit to Moses that we see there. Any other thoughts there? All right. So we haven't talked too much about timeline. There's two timelines for the period of Exodus. I tend to look at 1 Kings 6, verse 1, and it says 480 years before Solomon, which puts us about 1450 BC, maybe 1460. There's some problems with both. If you take the 1 Kings text literally, this is where it puts you. So I kind of fall on that side of things for that reason. In this particular case, Pharaoh's living down in Thebes, which is about 400 miles south of the Nile Delta. This is some hieroglyphs from, I think they said, based on the Pharaoh, around 1458 to 1440, right in that time period. And you'll notice a couple of things here. What are they doing? I think they're making bricks. I see them collecting some straw, and this is, of course, a part of a huge wall of things. They're stomping on things. Their metallurgy is there in the middle. They're definitely making bricks and carrying it forward. Do you notice anything else about this particular image? We're going to zoom in on this section here with my next click. And there's a couple of people who stand out. The Egyptians would like to tell you they did all the work themselves, but I think there are indications throughout this that there were slave drivers, and therefore some of these images are slaves. In fact, many of the other hieroglyphs, you don't see people without clothes on or just little loins. You see much more voluptuous dress throughout there. And I don't know that that's a pure litmus test, but there is indication from this time period that these things were going on, as we saw in the first and second chapter. And if we look over to Deuteronomy at this passage, verses 5 through 6, and I'm going to come back to this in a few classes. There's a few more verses that go on from here. But this is when you bring your tithe, when you bring the first offerings to God. And Deuteronomy says, "And you shall make a response before the Lord your God. A wandering Armenian or Syrian was my father, and he went down into Egypt and sojourned there, few in number, and there he became a nation, great, mighty, and populous. And the Egyptians treated us harshly and humiliated us and laid on us hard labor. Then we cried to the Lord, the God of our fathers, and the Lord heard our voice and saw our affliction, our toil, and our oppression." So we did talk about, this was about 400 years after Joseph went to Egypt. And we see this scene unfolding here that was supposed to be the remembrance when you come to bring the first fruits to God here in Deuteronomy. We saw language like this. We saw what this passage is describing in chapter 1, the oppression of the people. And God is going to specifically call out here in chapter 3 that he sees this toil, this affliction, this oppression. And I think it's, there's a lot of indication that when the people would sit down and listen to the Torah, they would listen to it all in one setting, right? And it was a continuous reading. This passage from Deuteronomy, calling on the law, is asking them to regularly remember what we're about to study today. And I think that's important, not just in the sense of this is how important it was to these people. I think it's also important because it backs up the credibility of the passage. This wasn't a parable. This wasn't a story that illustrated how God behaves. I think these things are real, and I think it's very important to the identity and the people of Israel throughout the next 1,300 years and into Christ. This is how they believed. These things really happen. So this map, it pulls into a couple of things, but I like the scaling, and I like the general layout here. It has some things from Josephus in it. Josephus suggests in his first 20 years, Moses went down to Cush to battle the Cushites. Obviously, there's no record of that in the Old Testament. But that's what you see, number 2, going down. Goshen, if you'll remember, is the land that was given to Joseph by the Pharaoh back then. And these are the speculative locations for Ramses and Pithom of this text. And I think it's pretty safe to say most of the people of Israel were living in this northern part near the Nile Delta. And from what we can tell, Mount Horeb is down there in the Sinai Peninsula, and this is where Moses has fled some years into his life, down there by number 4. How many years did we say? I think Acts tells us at this point. How many years has gone by in Moses' life? 40. Is he a young man, changing his personality every day, growing? Probably not. He is who he is at this point, right? And so he comes, we get to the end of chapter 2, and he comes to this area, and he's marries a daughter of the sorry, my brain is blanking on me here. The Midianites. I don't know why I couldn't say that. So he marries a priest, a daughter of the priest of the Midianites. Who were the Midianites? Do y'all remember? How were they related? they're actually from from Jacob's fourth child, and it was not in the 12 of promise, and but they would have known the God of Abraham. They would have known of the things much like the Ishmaelites would have, and we actually see them coming up in the story of Moses. They're the ones who sold. I mean, the story of Joseph. They're the ones who sold Joseph to Potiphar's household. So I think it's an interesting telling of this, because Moses is able to be accepted by these people at this time, right? For the next 1,000, 1,500 years we ever hear of these type of people, are they friendly? Are they welcoming to the Jews or the Israelites? Not at all. Not at all. I mean, I think that's the right answer. And so one thing that suggests for me is this was written by someone who knew there was a time when there was something friendly. If you were writing this in 600 BC or 400 BC, many years later, you would have no idea that there was a time when these people weren't adamant enemies. And I think that speaks to an early authorship and is an important part to call out as we test the scripture here. And so, we're about 80 years has passed by. I mean, just these things happen like this in these first couple of chapters, right? As we get into chapter 3, about 80 years has passed by. Moses is now an old man, and he is down here around Mount Horeb. This is the view from what we might call Mount Musa or the Mount of Moses. It's historically acclaimed to be something close to Sinai. And this is what you could see if you were up taking your sheep up there. We also see it's called the Mountain of God. Moses wrote this after the fact. He might have met God there and from then on called it the Mountain of God. There's some other speculation that this was revered by locals as the Mountain of God always. And one thing that struck me is, does this look like a place to be shepherding your flock? Yeah, and I don't know how to talk through that. It's just something that's interesting. Well, Horeb means an extremely dry place. But you're right. Israel itself, the land flowing with milk and honey, it's still a lovely place to visit. I don't know that the weather has made it what it once was, but yeah, for sure. Yeah, the layout of the land has changed. It's a great point. Okay, so he is out with his father-in-law's sheep. I'd like to talk a little bit about Jethro being a priest, but we won't. I don't think we'll get into that today. Other than to know that maybe Jethro knew of Yahweh or the God of Abraham. So now Moses was keeping the flock of his father-in-law Jethro, the priest of Midian, and he led his flock to the west side of the wilderness and came to Horeb, the mountain of God. And the angel of the Lord appeared to him in a flame of fire and out of the midst of a bush. He looked, and behold, the bush was burning, yet it was not consumed. All right, so we've talked a little about where Moses was and who appears to him. An angel of the Lord appeared to him in the flame. Do we see language like this, angel of the Lord, anywhere else in the scripture? Mm-hmm. Yeah. I'm thinking specifically of our Daniel class. There's several ways this is alluded to, but Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, and there's fire there. And you know, I think so there's some speculation. I think there is a way to read specifically in Daniel that Jesus is there, right? And I'm not going to go so far as to say this was Jesus, but this presence of God was appeared to him. And this scene is miraculous, is it not? I mean, especially if Horeb is a dry place, to just see a bush just burning. I mean, imagine a dead bush in Texas in August, right? You light it on fire. How long is it going to be lit up? Not that long, right? And so this appeared to him, and it was not consumed. We've all heard the story so many times. Is it impressive to us anymore? It should be, right? This was, and we'll see here in a second, this was not something normal. This wasn't just something caught fire and he turned around to look at it. Moses said, I will turn aside to see what this great sight and why this bush is not burned. When the Lord saw that he had turned aside to see, God called to him out of the bush, Moses, Moses. And he said, here I am. So even Moses did not consider this event to be something common or just there's a brush pile over there. It was something impressive, and his curiosity grabbed him, and he turned to see what was happening. And it's interesting. God's response, maybe it's not conditional, but he's definitely holding his reaction until Moses looks his way, right? He doesn't engage with Moses until Moses says, hey, let's look at what this is, right? Does Moses, this is an interesting question. Does Moses know Yahweh at this point? Maybe through his mom. Does his mom know Yahweh? Yeah. So this is actually a great theological debate. If you start digging into online sources and things, you'll see a lot of different opinions about this. I think one of the biggest things that you could take out of this the conversation is that when the Israelites leave and they're commanded to break out into their tribes, what do? They seemingly know which one to go to, which means they've talked about their lineage, and I would assume they've talked about, therefore, Yahweh. But this is where it gets interesting. It doesn't really seem like Moses knows what to do, and would any of us? I doubt it. But God has to tell him who he is. And further, we're going to see Moses say, well, who do I tell the people that you are, right? And I don't know if there's a blending of the Midianites and the Egyptians and all the different cultures and who is this God that's talking to me, or if it's just God emphasizing his identity here. And I think either it's probably not important, but it is interesting to think through what was going on at the time of this 400 years that the people were growing in the land of Egypt. So God said, do not come near, take your sandals off your feet, for the place on which you are standing is holy ground. And he said, I am the God of your father, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. And Moses hid his face, for he was afraid to look at God. What does this tell us about how God wants us to approach him, how Moses reacted, and how we should think about approaching God? Respect and reverence. So that take action to show that you understand what you're doing is important, that you have respect. Take something of your heart and your person to say, hey, I respect what I'm doing here. Yeah, David.
I kind of feel like this provides an example of just the objective fact of who God is. I think one of the limitations we have today is like we're limited by our imaginations. And so when we pray to God, sometimes it's funny, people will get nervous to say a prayer in front of a large group, but we don't fathom the idea of approaching the throne room of God as he sits and listens to your voice. We just can't even imagine the power and majesty of it as our voice is coming out of our chest. And so this is like an objective example of if you were in his presence, this is what happens.
Yeah.
I can't help but think about thinking about the context of this situation here and the oppression of the Israelites under Egypt for so long. We know clearly that Egypt has numerous gods that are all named and all have a very specific purpose, but may have been maybe the worship of those gods or the care in which they talked about these gods were very loose. And so I think you see God here talking to a Moses who has been this Egyptian culture, right? And these gods and that society has been ingrained in him in a way. And I think he's having to be clear and direct and explicit about who he is and how you're to approach him. Mm-hmm. And even when he asks about who I should tell my people you are, what is your name? He's asking that because they're used to this Egyptian society where all gods are named and all gods have a specific purpose. And he's giving, his answer is something much greater and grander than that. It's almost untouchable. I am who I am.
Yeah, Michael.
While we're on the topic of that, of the name, I know I'm getting off topic of your question a little bit, but I'm going off my memory here. Didn't study it again yet, but this is the first time we read of anybody asking God what his name would be, right? From Genesis all the way up to this point. Like, this passage sticks out, like I have it highlighted, and that's my memory. And so, part of me thinks that maybe he's asking that because, well, we always refer to a God, but it just entered his mind kind of like, well, what should we call you? Since we have this relationship going, or maybe that's what he thought. We can't tell what he thought, but it is an intriguing passage to me for that reason, that he asked that question and then you get God's response.
Yeah. Absolutely. So, God makes a promise here, and he identifies himself as, and Michael kind of pushed us over into that edge, so we'll move forward here. I think is a great segue. So God made a promise, and is this the first time God has made a promise, or maybe even this particular promise? Mm-hmm. Well, that, but I think even going back even further to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Well, there was the three-part that I think one part has come true of the three-part promise, right? The people have grown to great number. I'm not saying that will stop here, but I think that was Pharaoh's problem, right? Is the people were at such great number. Number two was he would give them a land, and I think that's what we really see God reiterating here to Moses and to the people of Israel. I'm going to give you this land which has been promised to your forefathers, and he doubles down on that promise again. And then, of course, all nations will be blessed through the seed. So what I've kind of already hit on it, but look at verses 7 through 10 here. Maybe just take 60 seconds to read these verses, and you tell me what God is promising here. 7 through 10. Mm-hmm. All right, what do you see? What is God promising specifically? Deliverance. I hear your cry, your oppression, your pain, and I promise you deliverance. Not just deliverance away from, but deliverance where? A land that's spacious, flowing with milk and honey. If you're a slave in Egypt, is this going to be an appealing offer? Yeah. Yes, Ian.
What did Jordan say the Exodus meant again? Something about a name.
Well, I think Exodus means to come out or to be called out, but the Hebrew word for this is it translates to the book of names.
Yeah. So I was thinking about that. I mean, really what I'm seeing here is God is promising that they're going to be a nation again. They're going to be Israel again. They're going to reclaim their name essentially as God's people, God's nation.
Yep. No, I think that's absolutely right. And maybe to what might then be currently the most fruitful place on earth, right? There was actually an Egyptian fugitive who ran away to the land of Yaa. It's probably called the Levant back then. And he writes very similar descriptions of the land. He ultimately gets invited back to die in Egypt, but he writes about grapes and olives so abundant that there's more wine than there is water in the land, and there's no shortage of cattle for any one person, and just the amount of abundance and lushness that goes on there is recorded, interestingly, in a secular source by an Egyptian in a very similar time period. And so God's promise, what I wanted to say about that is the people would have known how productive this. I mean, they are in the Nile Delta, right? It's a pretty productive place in terms of agriculture as it is. And so where are you taking us to? This place that I think might have been well known to be very fertile and lush. This should have excited Moses, and you would think this would excite most people. We're going to come back to Moses' response in the next couple of slides, but I'm going to give about 3 or 4 minutes here and get with your group, turn around, make a new friend, and talk about God's self-revelation. Michael, I cut that comment off with Michael because I wanted to go here, right? And there's several ways that God identifies himself, particularly before the end of chapter 3, or maybe even in the first 13, 14 verses or so. So take a minute and talk about who does God say that he is? What do those words mean, and why would this matter to the people? All right, I hear some really good discussion. Any volunteers of what your group discussed? Yeah, Brian.
Well, we mentioned it's a preamble, but it's a preamble based upon. It's a preamble, but it's a preamble based upon an assumed prior knowledge or a known prior knowledge. He doesn't explain to him what a God is and why he is God. He says, I'm the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. As you mentioned, they all know who their tribes are. They know who their father Jacob is. And I guess I'll make an assumption that if they know Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, they know the promises given to Abraham. And clearly Moses knew he was a Hebrew. So to answer your question, it does sound like Moses had a knowledge of who God was.
Yep, I like that. What about why he chose the words he chose or what they mean? Michael?
It makes, to me, it just seems like a real succinct way to kind of say what you read in Revelation over and over again. You know, the God who was and is to come. You know, he says, "I am." You know, that's what you will call me. So you know, I think it's kind of referring to that he is and he always has been and he always will be, the existence of God.
There's a transliteration of some Greek words that said, "I will be who I will be," meaning exactly what you were saying. I was when Abraham was here. I am for you today, and I will be that I am in the future at any point in time. I think there's a lot of the magnificent power of God over time in this statement here for sure. Would this, Albert?
Isn't the word that he's using to describe himself a very sacred word and not used commonly? And it would have given them for him to step up and use the word that he's told to use would draw attention and give them insight to go, we need to find out more about what's going on here.
Yeah, I think, are you referring to Yahweh? I think that, and it's interesting because several times in this passage, the verse starts off, God heard and the Lord said, and those two, and one of them is calling on the name of Yahweh, which some have indicated this is where the name Yahweh would have originated from, but there was definitely something special that will be heard.
I think this I am topic is definitely a rabbit hole, so I won't go down it too far. But if you look at the root word, if you just I am, it's was, come to pass, came, has been. So as Michael was alluding to, it's always was and is to be, all that will come. I am that. I am that Lord, the Lord.
Yep. Yeah, Brian.
It is also the name that Jesus, or title. I am is the present tense. There's no past tense. I am, I'm here, I'm now.
That's right.
And that's Christ who referred to himself in the same way.
Absolutely. Which is a direct revelation of their identity together. We'll come back to that, but great responses there. So, okay, we get the benefit of 2020 look back here, and we're looking at this, and the people are oppressed, and the God of the universe says, I'm going to bring you out and give you everything you ever wanted, and Moses should be like, yeah. Is that what we get from him here? I'm not going to make all the 80-year-olds raise up their hand. I'm not going to shame anybody like that, but at 80 years old, are you looking to start a new venture to go lead a nation away from the pharaohs of Egypt? I mean, it's not Mel Gibson and the Patriot enthusiasm, right? It's probably like, I'm an old man. What qualification? I've been out here in the wilderness for 40 years. I'm not I'm not a general. I'm not a politician. I'm not, I'm walking sheep around the desert here, right? And so he gives these 5 excuses or rebuttals, maybe is a better term. And I wanted to talk about each one for a minute. So we see here the first one, who am I? What is Moses saying here in verse 11? And I guess I just kind of hammered on it, didn't I? But why are you picking me? Pharaoh's claimed to be deity themselves, right? And Moses knew that of himself, that he was not. So how am I going to go up? And what's the Lord's response to Moses? I will be with you. Is there any more relatable thing in this story than this response for each of us? Yeah, David.
Yeah, one of the themes we try to drive home in Genesis was that each successive patriarch and really each character in Genesis had to learn the fundamental lesson that God's will can only be accomplished by his miraculous might, period. And that humbling message that each man had to come to terms with was manifested in Abraham, was manifested in Jacob, was manifested in Joseph, and then now we see it with Moses here. It's not going to be by your might. It happens by my miraculous will.
Yep. We ask this of ourselves all the time, right? And God doesn't say, I will make you great. He says, I will be with you. I will do this through you. And I think we want the first, right? We want the former. We want God to make us great. But that's not what happens. God is with us through all of the things that he asks us to do in our life and puts us through. In verse 13, I don't know what to say, God. Again, I'm a shepherd. I don't know how to convince Pharaoh. I don't know how to convince the people. And this is where we get the I am who I am statement. And says, you have the authority of the God that always was and the God that always will be by your side. Don't worry about them not believing you. Don't worry about if you have credibility. I have all the credibility I need, and I will help you convince them. Is Moses convinced? They will not believe me if I tell them, in verse 1 of chapter 4. And how does God respond to Moses here? Yeah, David. Oh, Terry.
It attests to his humility. When he says to God that, here I am, a shepherd. I've been here for 40 years. Here you call on me to do these things. And that speaks to his humility. That's why he's one of the most humble men anywhere in his time.
I think you're right. And in our recordings in Acts and Hebrews, none of this is counted against his faith. Not once do we see that, right? And I think Terry's onto something. We should approach the throne of God as humbly and respectfully as possible. And maybe that's what I was going to get to with this list, and maybe less eloquently than Terry put it, but it's okay to approach God humbly and let him work through us. And so, coming back to this excuse of they will not believe me, and for one, what does God do for Moses so that they will believe him? Gives them power with his rod specifically. Yeah, he could make the serpent become, or the staff become a serpent. He could do the leprous hand and turning water into blood with this staff. I mean, that's pretty impressive stuff. I don't know if that's directly how the plagues were enacted, but we do see Moses being given this power. He says, I'm not eloquent. I can't make these speeches. And God says, I will help you speak. I will give you the divine message. I will give you the words to say. And what do we read all throughout Deuteronomy? Eloquent speeches by Moses. Was he just selling himself short? No, God worked through him the way he said he would. And ultimately, he says, send someone else. And God allows for his brother Aaron to work with him.
Same way with the disciples, Jesus said, "It leads us now."
That's right. The Holy Spirit, God works through the intercessor to help us and gives us the words in the Scripture that he's preserved for us. Brian alluded to some of this. I think there's about 5 minutes left. In 4:19, it says that, we've seen he goes to Jethro, and Jethro gives him his blessing to go back and check on his brothers. So maybe Moses didn't tell Jethro the whole story. I don't know what that's about, but we see him start to return, and God assures him that go back to Egypt, for all the men who wanted you killed are dead. Here's another really interesting type and antitype. Matthew 2 in verse 20, after the death of Herod, an angel appears to Joseph in a dream saying, get up and take the child and his mother and go to the land of Israel, for the people who are trying to take the child's life are dead. Very much similar words that we see here. Is there a comment over here, David?
It was just on the topic of, as far as Moses saying he wasn't eloquent. I used to think a lot of that, of kind of the similar mindset of like coming from the shepherd background and things like that for years before. It wasn't until I guess a week or so ago when Jordan was reading through Acts 7 and some of what Stephen had said, it caught my eye because in verse 21 and 22, where it mentions that Pharaoh's daughter took him away and nurtured him as her own son, Moses was educated in all the learning of the Egyptians, and he was a man of power in words and deeds. If anybody was going to go talk to the Egyptians, it would be a guy who was recorded as having been raised by the Pharaoh, was powerful in words and deeds. And so I wonder if what you almost see is the first of one of many of, Moses's attempts at negotiation, an attempt of getting out of doing what he knew needed to be done, more so than like a fear of public speech. I know he keeps going back to that, and eventually Aaron kind of steps into that, but Stephen, centuries later, says he was a man of power in words and deeds, and he's standing before God saying, I don't want to do it, I can't talk. I'll tell you what to say. Don't worry about that, I got you covered. So there's a little bit of irony there, I guess, looking at it through retrospect.
Well, it's almost like he was brought to this moment for a design purpose, but he did. That was in that section under the last 4:13, he did speak to Pharaoh, but I think my point was after that into Deuteronomy, Moses proved himself to be very worthy of speaking. Does that help? Okay. So what Brian alluded to one of these Jesus's "I am" statements, and there's many of them, and you might not even think I picked the best ones. But I think there's a direct application to us here from this story. In 3 verse 8, he comes and says, I have come down to deliver them out of the hand of the Egyptians and to bring them out of the land to a good and broad land flowing with milk and honey, to a place of the Canaanites. And he goes on to stay there. What do we see in John 14 verse 6? Jesus said to him, I am the way, the truth, and the life. I am the way, the truth, and the life. Here we see in 3 verse 8, God is showing them the way to their new life. I am is giving them a way, directing. We see throughout the rest of the book, he shows them directly the way with the pillar and other things. Oh, that's the second bell. Well, take a look at these other verses and go ahead and read chapters 5 and 6 for next Sunday, and we'll get a lot of opportunity this quarter to look at these New Testament references as it pertains to Moses. Thank you.